Welcome to the studio on this very rainy day, which is the best place to be on a day like today. So hopefully you've watched the demos and you've done a few cast drawings yourself. It's really important to focus on sight-size drawing before you begin painting. But today I'm going to introduce you to painting. So the best way to start this is with a cast. So there's not a lot of color to deal with, and it's just an extension of the charcoal sight-size drawing. Today I'm working slightly under life size, so I've pulled my easel forward so that when I look at the cast and my panel from our viewing distance, they appear to be the same scale. So I'm still working to the scale that I see here. So the same scale as the cast appears there will appear on the board. I'm working on a panel that I've just primed with some gesso. So we have a nice white surface. You could also do this on a canvas or even life size if you wanted to. But today we're just going to focus on introducing you to the basics of painting. I just want to run you through all of the materials that you're going to need. So first of all, you'll need a ruler for the very first mark that you'll make. I like to have some paper towel always to hand just to soften the charcoal. A block with some sandpaper on it. So this is about 240 grit, is great. We've got a plumb line, which is just a bit of string with a weight on it. You can do this with just a piece. Sometimes I use a piece of string and just tie a bolt to it or something. And a selection of stumps is quite useful. I've got 3 different sizes here. A kneaded eraser. So these are really useful for kind of getting, you can mold them to a point if you want to get a very precise type of mark. I use 2 types of charcoal, so I've got HB and B. B really for the first stages because it's very soft charcoal, so very easy to erase. HB slightly sharper, so better for more delicate rendering. And then you need 2 types of mirror. So we've got a black mirror here. But actually, I tend to use my phone. These days, everyone seems to have a black mirror in their pocket, so you can just use that. And then another handheld mirror. This one came from, I think, a hardware store. Ideally without a border, because sometimes you find ones that have borders. Okay, so it's all you need for the drawing, and of course the paper. I like to use a rag paper, which is a handmade paper that's quite thick and has a nice texture to it. But there's a lot of different options, and it depends on the type of drawing you'd like to do. If you want a smoother paper, you have a more kind of smooth finish. If you want a rougher paper, you can have a slightly looser handling. So the way to sharpen the charcoal using the block is to hold it very gently. I've broken and always seem to break charcoal, so the best way to do this is just to keep practicing. But we're just going to gently sharpen the charcoal on the paper and rotate it. But it's really important not to press down too much or you'll snap it. So our aim here is to have a long point, and the longer it is, the longer it'll stay sharp. Okay, that's pretty good. I mean, you could keep going and make it even sharper if you wanted to, but I'm happy with that. And I will usually sharpen 10 charcoals so that they're ready. So when I'm drawing, I don't have to stop and waste time when the model's posing to resharpen my charcoals. So that's everything that you will need. I'm going to show you how to make the oil painting medium that I use. And what you'll need to do this is 3 empty jars with good lids, some Canada balsam, which is a type of resin, some mastic, which is a different type of resin, and sun-thickened linseed oil. So this is linseed oil that has been thickened in lead trays. You also need some turpentine. I always have a bit of paper towel as well because these get very, very sticky. So this medium was used by Rubens and Van Dyck, or a very similar version. There was a physician called Theodore de Mayer, and he wrote the de Mayer manuscripts based on his conversations with Van Dyck and with Rubens. And my teacher, Charles Cecil, helped to develop this version that I'm going to show you today. So the first thing you need to do is split the Canada balsam with turpentine. So we're going to go 50-50 for this. So this stuff is extremely sticky. I'll start by, I always do this by eye, really. So we're going to get some of this first, which is a bit like honey, and comes from balsam trees. And this medium, it gives a lot of flexibility to your paint. So it's good for kind of blending the paint together and just having another tool to adjust the consistency of the paint. It also creates a really solid film. So when the painting dries, it is a very impenetrable film. And Rubens' paintings are some of the best preserved in the history of art. And one of the reasons is because of this medium. Okay, so I'm just going to do this by eye. We're going to put just double that volume with turpentine. Okay. And then we're just going to mix that together. Make sure that lid is on tightly. And it'll start to dissolve. Okay, it's good to do this for about 5 or 10 minutes. I'm going to do the quick version. Let's just leave that to sit whilst I get on with the next bit. So then we're going to do the same thing, but with mastic. You can make this medium just using Canada balsam, but I like to use mastic because I find it's a bit too sticky otherwise. So same thing, we're just going to put some of the mastic in our jar. And then double that volume again with our turpentine. So just do this by eye, it's fine. It's good practice for making cocktails. Okay, you just want to make sure that that's dissolved. That one dissolves much more quickly than the Canada balsam. It's a bit heavier. Okay, now we're going to combine them. Okay, so essentially this medium is half oil and half varnish. So our oil is our sun-thickened linseed oil. The other half is a combination of these two. And so that half is going to be 2/3 Canada Balsam cut with turpentine, 1/3 mastic cut with turpentine. So again, we're just doing that by eye. We start with our mastic. Should I have the right? Let's just actually keep that in that jar. Okay, so this one is Canada Balsam cut with turpentine. So we want to add 1 part mastic turpentine to what is essentially 2 parts Canada Balsam turpentine. So let's see. Okay. We're then going to double that volume with our sun-thickened linseed oil. So if you get into the habit of using this medium, your paintings will hopefully last hundreds and maybe even thousands of years. And restorers will find it very, very hard to over-restore it, because once the top layer is dried and the film has been created, it is very, very hard to remove the paint or to take off any glazes. It's also a really good glazing medium. So glaze is when you have a very translucent consistency of paint, and you put that on top of dry paint. So this creates a really nice glaze. Okay. And so the last step is just to mix all of that together. And I usually set a timer and try to shake it for 10 or 15 minutes. Make sure that that is closed. Okay, and there you have your demi-heure medium, which is a nice kind of gloopy consistency now. That sometimes it settles, especially if you don't mix it enough. So I keep it in this jar, and every day that I use it, I'll just shake it before I pour it out onto my palette. But during the course of the painting, I'll show you how to use this, because a lot of students really struggle with this, because it's very easy to become very, very sticky, or to have an unpleasant paint surface. But if you learn how to use it correctly, it can do really wonderful things, and it gives your paint a lot more versatility. You can have really nice thick impastos, really thin glazes. You can leave quite choppy marks next to each other, and you can blend it really clearly. So it's a great medium. If you can't get hold of all of these items, then a substitute would be just to use the sun-thickened linseed oil as your medium, cut with a bit of turpentine. This is a very specialist medium, so if you can't get hold of it, then that's okay. That's a perfectly good substitute. But if you can, it's really fun to experiment with. So I'll just map this out actually, so you can see the measurement, because it can be a bit confusing. So you've got, within our jar, 50% of the total here is just sun-thickened linseed oil. Of the other 50%, we have 1/3 mastic. We have 1/3 mastic cut with terps, and 2/3 Canada balsam cut with terps. Okay. So I hope that you enjoy making your medium and also look forward to using it. Before we start the painting, we're just going to run through all of the materials that you'll need. So first, a palette. It doesn't matter what shape, really, as long as it's at least A4 size, I'd recommend. This is just one that I made that clips onto an easel for landscape painting. You need a bit of paper towel always, so you can control the amount of paint on your brush. So I always have that alongside my palette cups. And you'll need 2 palette cups, one for medium, one for turpentine. In terms of the paints, for portraits, I use the limited palette. So we've got titanium white or lead white, if you can get hold of it, yellow ochre, cadmium red light or vermilion. That one's interchangeable. Cadmium red is it has a higher tinting strength, and this was Zorn's palette, and ivory black. So it's amazing the amount of variety that you can get with just these 4 colors. So essentially, the black is your blue, and so just that and white, you'll get a very cool color. And then you've got a yellow and a red to adjust the color of that. Additional colors that you could use, you've got English red, which is quite a very, very strong brown, but a lot of the British school painters would often use a kind of earth red. Also an ultramarine blue, which tends to be more for backgrounds and clothings than on the portrait, but it's a good extra to have. So that covers our paints. In terms of brushes, I think it's good to start out with just a general range of sizes. I use a lot of hog hair brushes. When I was training, we were taught to use sable hair brushes too, which are much more expensive and a very soft brush, so good for kind of detail work. But I tend to use mostly the hog head brushes. I like the kind of flat end brushes because I tend to make quite calligraphic marks. Hog hair brushes also hold a lot of paint. But the best way to use brushes or to build up a collection of them is just to start with a selection, see which ones you're using and which ones you tend to lack, and build them up accordingly. You will definitely need some small brushes, even maybe some 000 brushes for highlights or very small detail work. The most useful brush size I find is kind of, I'd say, a thumb size. So these kinds of sizes I tend to use more often than not. You'll need definitely some bigger brushes for your backgrounds. So different brush, different job was how I was taught to paint. So you really want the variety of marks. Also, something to hold the brushes in is quite useful. We have our medium that we made, so that's here in our jar. Some turpentine, and so we're going to be working with the 2 of these. I'll show you how when we get to the painting. And then a brush cleaner. So this you can just use mineral spirits to clean your brushes with afterwards. So those are all the materials that we need. And then, of course, a canvas. So I tend to use, for sketches or for one-shot alla prima paintings, I prepare my own panels. And these are I get them cut at a local wood shop in Florence. It's just birchwood ply, 6mm. And then I put 2 layers of shellac varnish, which is a varnish that's made from the lac beetle. It secretes this varnish. So that's just 2 coats of shellac sanded down, and it creates a really nice, it seals the surface and creates a really nice surface to paint on top of. And you can add more layers if you want a less absorbent surface, and fewer layers if you want a more absorbent surface. So that's everything we need. So we're ready to get painting. So I have my palette set up here, and in one pot I have some turpentine, in the other I have some medium. And we only need 4 colours for the cast painting. So I have my titanium or lead white, your yellow ochre, raw umber, and the ivory black. And when we get to the portrait painting, we'll replace the raw umber with a vermilion red. But for the cast, this is all that we need. So the first thing that we're going to do is map out a few heights and widths. So I like to start with hog hair brushes because you can use a lot of paint, but you can still keep fairly soft edges. And so depending on the size of the mark that you're making, you'll want to use a different size brush. I tend to use a lot of this size, which is a 4, but different brands vary with the numbers. But I'd say the size of your finger is a good size to start with. So in terms of the oil, if you're using the medium or if you're using linseed oil, you always want to build up more oil in the top layers. And so the lower layers of paint will just be diluted using the turpentine. I've also got a piece of paper towel here so that I can adjust the amount of paint on my brush. So often you might find the mixtures get very runny, and you can just dab the brush on the paper towel to take out some of that oil. So I'm going to start with a neutral colour. So if we get some of our raw umber, maybe a bit of our yellow ochre too. So something between not the darkest dark and a kind of mid-light. And I'm diluting that with a small amount of terps. And if we just dab the brush here, we can make sure that it's not too runny. So the first thing we'll do is map out our heights. So standing in your viewing position, you're going to use a plumb line. I find it easier sometimes just to use the back of a mirror or a brush. The plumb line for me sometimes is just a bit too flimsy, but there's no right or wrong way. So the first thing we're going to do is map out the height of the top of the head. And the way that we do that is to line up the top of our mirror, our plumb line, with the top of the head of the cast. And we also want this line to pass over to our panel so that we can memorize that position, walk forward and make a mark. So the top of the head is about here. And then walk back and check the mark. Okay. So we could put in a plumb line, and I'll do that because I think especially when you're first starting, it's a really useful way to get things mapped out. So I need to choose where I want my plumb line to be. On the portrait, a useful place is where the line can intersect with a number of points. So the brow, base of nose, mouth, chin. So the shadow side of the cast is a good plumb line. And it's roughly central, so that's a useful one, slightly over to the left. But I'm just going to map out roughly the width of the base to make sure I position my cast where I'd like it to be. And then from there we can find the position of our plumb line. So which is actually quite far over to the left there. So using a ruler, or in this case a brush, I'm just going to map out my plumb line. So you don't need to be too precious about these marks at the beginning. I mean, you want to put them down with intention and as accurately as you can. But until you map out your heights and widths, it's very hard to know if anything's right. Anyway, so let's continue with our heights. So we have the top of the cast. And then I'm going to go for the corner of the brow on the shadow side. So that's this point here. And then I'm going to map out the base of the nose. So you're looking for the edges of the light and the shadow. So ignoring any detail within the light or within the shadow, just going for the transition or the border between the two. Okay, next we can map out a mark for the mouth. So the upper lip is in shadow, and so it helps to map out that one first. And then maybe a mark for the lower lip as well, so the dark shadow under the lower lip. And then we have the dark under the chin, so the shadow underneath the chin. And then finally, oh no, we could also do one for the neck because there's a shadow there, so this point here. And then the last height that we need to map out is the very base of the cast. Okay, so now we have a few heights. So we're starting to get the footprint down. Next, we want a corresponding width for each of those points. So if I start at the brow, I'm going to go from that corner of the brow, well, from my imaginary line to the contour on the left, so the furthest contour. And the way that we do that is to trap the width using our plumb line. So make sure you keep your weaker eye closed and your more dominant eye open so you can see both the mirror and the cast. And we're going to, and keep your arms straight. It's really important because if you move, you'll change the proportions. And it's starting to rain a lot outside, so I'm very pleased that we're inside today doing this. I'm going to measure the width of from the brow to the contour on the left, and then bring my mark over, line my thumb up with the line, and memorize the distance from there to the left. Just roughly there. So now we want a mark from the point from our plumb line to the contour on the right. So same thing, but this time lining up this side of the mirror or your plumb line with our plumb line and then trapping the width from that point to the contour on the right. Which is roughly here. And then you can also do an overall width mark just to make sure that 1 + 1 = 2. So trap the total width, bring that over, and check. It's just slightly small. This could possibly come out a little bit there. And don't worry about getting these marks absolutely precise, because they can only ever be so precise when you're using a bit of string or taking these measurements. The idea is just to get a footprint down so that we can then assess the drawing after. Okay, so next we're going to go from tip of the nose again to the furthest contour on the right. Here. And the same thing on the left. And already I'd start to suggest the angle of those marks. If they're just dots, it can become a bit confusing. So already we're starting to suggest the side of the cheek, top of the cast, the direction of the nose, the direction of the mouth and the brow, so that our eye can, as quickly as possible, start to recognize that this is a representation of that cast. Okay, so next we'll go for the pit of the neck to the furthest contour on our right. It's about here. Just check that mark. And then the same thing from that point to the contour on the left. I'll also go from the chin to the neck on the right. It's a useful mark. And the same on the left. Okay. We could also find something for the hairline. On a model, this would be more obvious, but plaster cast, it's a lot more subtle. But it would help just to separate the space between the brow and the hair. So I'll just map out that height too, which is roughly here. Okay, next, I want you to put down your plumb line or your mirror and to start to use your eye. Your eye will be much more accurate than the mirror or the measurement anyway. And this will also enable you to start to train your eye. So our next task is to join the dots. And so we're going for outline. Outline, shadow line, shadow. So first we want to map out all of the external contour, then all of the contour of the shadow line, and then we'll mass the shadows in. So I'm still working with my raw umber and some turpentine. So trying to find the balance between a fluid paint consistency that is thin, but it is not watery. So if it's too watery, you can just use the paper towel. If it's too thick, just add a bit more turpentine. So I'm going to also map out the outline and the shadow line simultaneously. And this is how we'll be working when we get to the portrait painting. So starting first of all with the shadow that runs down the left side, or our left side of the nose. This shape is called the Van Dyke Z in studio talk, because it creates kind of Z shape, Z shape here. And it's a really useful mark to start with, because you have both a height and a width, and you can then build from the nose to the eyes or down to the mouth. It's nicely central. and Van Dyck because he used it so well in his portraits. So I'm looking for the contour of that Van Dyck Z. And don't worry too much about being extremely accurate. You're being as accurate as you can at this stage to then come back later with them and make more informed decisions. And I suggest that you use as many straight lines when drawing as you can. So even a curved line could be considered a series of straight lines. So straight to a point, straight to a point. And so we're looking for these apex, these angle shifts along a contour. And that will be, it'll make it a lot easier to construct the drawing here. So moving around the cast is the best way to start. So don't get caught up on one area. You're trying to evolve the shape as a whole. So I'm very fortunate to have a cast to work from here. But if you don't have a cast, you can improvise. You can use anything that's white, really. So even a white mug or a vase or something where you can really study a very simple value range. So you've got your light, your shadow, and your background. And for a shadow box, you could even just get a cardboard box and cut 3 sides off of it and put some black paper in. Ideally, you want the light source coming from slightly above. There are always ways to improvise. So I'm going to continue just mapping out my contour as best as I can. So I'm trying to complete a solid contour here. But with the painting, you can move slightly faster along than with the drawing. So we don't have to find all the shadow edges. If you know that a part of the panel is in shadow, so the background, for example, then you can block that in quite quickly because it will only help your eye to see more clearly. So once I complete a rough outline, I'm going to go straight in with my background. So I'm ignoring any information in the lights for now, just going for the big impression, the big light and shadow. And if you take your eyes out of focus and you squint right down, that becomes even more obvious. And if you did need to erase anything, I mean, we'll paint over all of this, so don't worry too much. But it is important to keep your drawing organized and very clean. So anything that isn't necessary is actually just obstructing your eye. If I get a dry brush and just put some turpentine on there and maybe dry it a little bit, I can use that as an eraser. So I made this chin a bit too small, so I can just use the brush with terps on to push that paint off. The same here, this is cutting in a little bit too much. You just push that over. So I've got enough information now to start blocking in my main values. Oil paint is a much more forgiving medium than charcoal or than watercolor or anything else. So you can be very flexible with it. And that's why we can start to block things in more quickly. So first I'm going to mix up a background color. So every time we get a new color, we want a new brush. So you keep your brushes organized, and you can always go back to that value and to that color if necessary, or when necessary, because it will be. So mixing still some turpentine and some black. The background's not completely black because there are some parts of it that are darker than others. So we can warm that up or lighten that up using some raw umber. So for the first layer of paint, I'm going to keep the paint fairly thin. So we want to build oil paint up, fat over lean, both in terms of thickness, but also in terms of oil. So more oil, more paint later on. Beginning, less oil, more terps, less paint. I'd call that an inky consistency. So again, it's not dripping off the brush, but it's also not thick and kind of clay-like. So I'm going to use that with my bristle brush to block in some of the background. And it's nice to change the direction of the marks when you're covering a large area like a background. If you start to paint things just up and down like a wall, they tend to look very flat. By scrubbing the paint in and changing the direction, you create a bit more movement. I'm going to add a very small amount of my medium just to keep the paint consistency from going too matte. And it's important that you keep coming back so you don't just block in the whole background, because as soon as you start to map things out, you'll be able to see more information and see things you can change. And you want to cover all of the background, so not leaving any edges at the moment that will distract your eye. So there is no one way to paint, but generally the shadows or the darks tend to read better when they're thinner, when they're lighter, and the lights tend to be more, it seems to be better described when there's thicker paint. So I always try to keep my darks fairly thin. I'll go over the background again. I'm using quite an absorbent panel, so this will dry quite quickly. But for now, I just want a dark value so that my eye could start to correct the shapes on the cast. Okay, next I want to put my shadow in. So if I get a new brush and mix up a shadow color. So the shadow is lighter than the background, but darker than the lights. It's actually very similar to raw umber in terms of the color. Maybe some of the yellow ochre as well. So on this palette, your black is your blue. Ivory black is a very cold black. And if you can see that, if you just mix black and a bit of white, it becomes a very blue-grey. So keep in mind that that is your cold. So if I want to cool down this mixture, I can add some black and some white. Okay. So some of the oil and some of the turpentine in the mixture. Still slightly colder. So you mix things as close as you can on the palette before putting them on the board or the canvas to compare them side by side. Still slightly colder. So now we can go back to our shadow on this Van Dyck Z and block that in. And then we have the whole left side of the hair there in shadow. So if you're not sure where the shadow edges start and finish, then just squint down and look at the cast with partially open eyes, and it'll be easier to see. There's also some shadow on this side of the cast too. So next I'm going to mix up a color for the lights. I'm working on a white panel, so I can kind of use the white panel as the lights at the start. But now I want to get even more specific and closer to the color and the value that's there. I also want to have a white on the brush so that I can correct my drawing of the shadows using that. So let's get another brush, slightly larger brush. We can mix up our lights. So the lights are kind of a warmish light. I'm going to add a touch of yellow ochre. So turpentine to make the paint slightly looser, and the medium so that you retain the richness and the oil in the paint. and then maybe a touch of this too, just to knock down the intensity of that yellow. So one of the first things I want to do is just to get rid of the plumb line, and so keep a very clean, organized drawing. So now we're going to work with our light on one brush, our shadow on the other brush, and our background on the third brush, to correct the drawing, any drawing mistakes that we can see. So ignoring the information within the shadow or within the lights for now, because first we're concerned with getting the big shape masked in. And you want to make sure that you use enough paint, because it's a lot easier to make changes when there's more paint down. So often when people start painting, they're afraid to use too much paint, so they use a very thin terpsy wash, and that actually makes things much harder to change. So I'm building up quite a thick paint for my lights. And you can push into the shadow with the lights and vice versa if you have enough paint on your brush. So you're making adjustments and corrections 1 or 2 marks at a time. So try not to put too many more marks down before coming back here to observe them from this point. Remember, you're doing all your viewing and decision making from back here. So every time you make a mark, you want to walk back. I'm going to use a slightly smaller brush now for my background dark, so that I can be more specific. So for the next pass of paint, I'm going to use slightly more of the medium in the background. And that will retain the richness in the paint consistency and stop it from sinking in. And sinking in is the term for when you have these patches of the paint surface where some of them are matte and some of them are glossy. Ideally, you always want to have a unified paint surface. And one of the difficulties with using medium is that often students will put too much medium in the lower layers and not enough in the upper layers. And so that causes the lower layers of paint to pull the oil out of the upper layers, and you get these patchy matte surfaces. So you want to ensure that you build up more oil or more medium in the upper layers to avoid that. And I'm trying to key as directly to nature as I can. So the background's slightly been absorbed by the background, so now I can go over it with a nice rich dark value. So I'm correcting the contour as I work my way around it. So next I want to introduce a slightly darker value for the lights, particularly when I'm working on edges. So to find some of these halftones here, this area is slightly darker. So I want to simultaneously draw the contours and also some of these halftones that will start to turn the form. So on another brush, keeping my lightest light on one brush, on another brush I'm going to mix up a slightly darker halftone colour. So have our white, and they're quite cool, the halftones, quite cold, so I'll use a bit of black like that. And it's useful to mix, if you're mixing very similar colours and values, it's useful to do them quite close to each other on the palette so that you can use the light that you already have to help you to assess how dark that value needs to be. And then I can switch brushes when I need to use a different colour or value. So I'm simultaneously trying to map out my contours, so my shadow contour and the external contour. So I'm going to go back to the external contour. And alternating between brushes as and when I need to. So now I'm switching to my shadow brush again. And back to the background brush. And as soon as you've got enough information down, it's really useful to use the mirror. So by looking at things in reverse, we are enabling ourselves to have a fresh eye and to see things as if for the first time again. So looking for any mistakes that jump out, they'll be a lot more obvious in the mirror. So I'm turning to the side so that I can see both the painting and the cast in reverse and comparing the two in reverse. You can also look up into the mirror to do the same. Sometimes it shows you a different set of corrections. Okay. So I'm still trying to hold off as much as I can and the information within the lights or within the shadows, and just looking at the transition between the two and the drawing between the two. So we no longer need our plumb line. So it's just a distraction after a while, so it's better to get rid of it and keep the drawing really nicely organized. And that will enable your eye to see. So I'm happy now with my external contour, so I can block in the dark of the background everywhere, so keeping things organized. A lot of painting is discipline, so even though I would like to go in and start rendering and straight away, I'm going to first keep my image organized, because that way I'll be able to see more easily when I get back to the cast. So using more medium this time to retain that rich color in the background. And the turpentine just to loosen the paint a bit so it can cover a larger area. So you can see how different the value of that is in relation to the paint that's dried underneath. So this has all been absorbed a bit by the panel and is a bit lighter than what I'm putting down currently. And if you're covering a larger area, then it makes sense to use a larger brush. Not only will you then have more variety in terms of your brush marks and mark making, but you also just cover the area more quickly. So I'm actually going to leave some of this to describe the base. Conveniently, that value is quite close to the value of the base. So I'm looking for the edges of the shadow that the cast is creating. Okay, I'm going to take a quick break, and even though we haven't got a model who requires breaks, our cast does not require breaks. It's really useful to step away from your painting every so often and not look at it, even just for 5 minutes, so that when you come back, you have a fresh eye and you're able to work in a much more efficient way. So I suggest that you don't look at it for 5 minutes and then get back to it after that. I'm ready to get back to the cast drawing. I took a short break so that my eye could have a refresh and I can come back and work in a more efficient way. So breaks are really useful so you step away from the painting and then come back to it. So if I have a quick look first everywhere just to have just to check some of my shapes, everything's pretty good, roughly in the right place, right size. I can now advance with the light side of the face. So first I'm going to look for the eye socket and positioning the brow on the right hand side. So I'm going to continue working with my 3 or 4 brushes here. So I have my lightest part of the cast, the kind of middle tone of the cast, and then a shadow color and a background color. So if I squint right down, you can start to see the forms a bit more clearly. So generally the neck is a tubular shape, a round cylindrical shape. And so there's a lighter part here, and things, as they turn away from that light source or light part, they get gradually darker. On the face, there's a light part on the forehead here. So we've got a light coming from above and slightly to the side. And on the cheek, we have a light part here. And so it's really useful to pay attention to that. So everything that is going away from the light source and towards the shadow is going to be stepping gradually darker. And there's no one way to do this. You could put down a general tone everywhere and then work the lights into that, or you could sit the lights beside the halftone values. It's entirely up to you. I'm going to put a more general value down on the whole cast now because I've still got the panel showing through. And so for that, I'll use a larger brush. And our middle value here. So I'm keeping this layer of paint quite loose because I want to paint over it. And you want to treat the whole paint surface as a unified image. So blocking in the head, also blocking in the neck and the shoulders here. So now on top of that, we can start to add some lights and also some dark. So that's a good base value. I'm going to start with this eye socket on the right. So using a slightly darker value than this, but something between the shadow and the lights. So I'm just stepping down from there and up from the shadow. I'm paying attention to the temperature, so the color of whether it's a warm or a cold. So some of the shadows are slightly warm, but generally they're quite cold. Generally, the lightest parts of the cast are light and the halftones are slightly cooler. But that will change depending on your light source and time of day, if you're using natural light. So again, squinting down to really simplify things, I'm just going to compare the two and make an educated guess where that eye socket on the right is. So on another brush now, I'm going to have a lighter value. So slightly warm, so a bit of the yellow ochre. And we're going to simultaneously draw the lights of the cast and the halftones. So starting in the eye socket. So every time there's a plane shift in the cast, there's also a shift in values. So on the side plane of the nose, the value is slightly darker than the front plane of the nose and also the cheek. So correcting the drawing and also applying the drawing one mark at a time. So going between the light, the halftone, and the darker value that I have in my hand at the same time. And then sometimes you'll need a much smaller brush for a more specific mark. So it's good to think in terms of different brush, different job. So if I want to be even more detailed, this smaller brush is better for that job. And it's nice to have the variety of mark making and brush sizes on the same surface. And don't worry if you put something in the wrong place or you want to adjust it, it's very easy to do with oil paint. You can either paint over it or push into it or replace it with the correct value. So don't be afraid of making mistakes in oil. It's very, very forgiving medium. And again, for the smaller marks, more precise marks, we want a smaller brush. So there's the highlight on the lower eyelid that I will need a smaller brush to draw. So now I'm going to get to this eye on the shadow side, which we don't see very much of, but we do, it is kind of catching the light to delineate the lower and the upper eyelid. So one of the biggest problems or struggles, I think, with painting is drawing what you see. And that means having to understand what it is that we're actually seeing. So from this distance, we're looking for the abstract light and shadow patterns that are created from our light source. So it's useful just to forget that you're painting an eye for now. Just look for that shape. So you don't need to worry about so much about eyelids and lower eyelids. You're looking for that particular shape and trying to recreate that in your painting. So far we've been turning the form by placing halftones side by side. Another way to turn the form is by blending these edges together. So either using a dry brush or just by mixing the two brushes together one after the other, you can turn the edge. So I'm going to get a clean, dry brush, hoghead brush, and also a piece of paper towel so I can wipe that brush clean. This edge is quite a soft edge, and so I can just drag the paint together following the line and then wiping it clean to soften that edge. So if we look at that from back here, that edge is now turning more convincingly. So sometimes when you're constructing the drawing, things can get a bit broken up, and so it's nice to go in and just blend things together every so often. It creates this softer focus. You can also make corrections with the softening brush, so I'm still making sure that I stand back and compare the two together, especially when there's a lot of paint down. Oil paint is more easily manipulated when there's a weight of paint down, because then you can start to push it around on the surface. Okay, so I'm going to continue with the features. So we could go from the nose now down to the mouth or even up to the forehead, but always trying to correct the shapes and the drawing and turn the form. And as we start to correct things, we'll start to notice other changes that we can make. So for example, I've just noticed that the hair on this side is much lower in relation to the eye socket, but until I'd put that eye socket in, I didn't have anything to kind of gauge that height with. Okay, so next I'm going to get down to the mouth area. So with site size, it's more important how things appear from this distance. So it's entirely up to you if you like the paint surface to be very soft and blended together, or if you like to leave some of the marks. I like to leave brush marks in paintings because for me painting should look and feel like a painting. But there's no right or wrong way to do it, as long as when you stand back here the image comes together. So you don't want the marks to be so disruptive and chaotic that it is distracting from the overall impression. When you stand back here, you want everything to appear as the cast does from this distance. So I tend to mix a lot on the canvas or on the panel. So blending things together. So wet paint into wet paint. It's just another way that another effect that you can create with oil paint. So if I wanted to soften this edge or blend it together, I could just mix it into the wet paint and then use the shadow to go over that until I have a nice soft edge. And we can be selective about the amount of information that we're including in the cast. I like to squint down and go for the visual impression and not get caught up in detail, particularly with the hair, which it can very easily become a whole pattern of squiggles and lines. So the focus on a portrait is usually the eyes. So everything away from there can be slightly broader in terms of the handling and also in terms of the focus. And by doing that, you add a visual element to the painting, because that's very related to how we see. If you're looking at somebody in the eyes, you're not seeing as much of the periphery vision, so the rest of the head. So often I have students ask, how do you know what's on each brush, or how do you remember what's on the brush? And really the answer to that is just experience. The more that you do it and the more disciplined you are, the more it becomes second nature. I often compare it to when I learned to drive and you're dealing with the gear stick and the pedals and everything inside the car. And you're thinking, how am I going to manage all of this and look out the window? So, but after a while, that all becomes second nature and you can do it automatically. This is your gear stick and your everything inside your car. Your setup here, as long as you keep things organized, you'll learn to instinctively know what's on each brush or know how to organize your palette. It just comes with experience. I spent a long time dropping brushes and getting in a mess. Okay, so we've roughly kind of mapped out all of our forms now. So we're going to have a look in the mirror and just check some of our shapes. And I'm going to blend a few things now because the surface is getting a bit patchy. And I'd like a smoother finish in some areas. So again, using a dry brush and some paper towel, we're just going to blend or soften some of our paint. So the type of surface that you're working on will play quite a big part in what your paint can do. I'm working on a very absorbent panel, and so the paint's kind of sticking to the panel more and is less easy to manipulate. If you had a smooth panel, then the paint would kind of slip around a lot more and probably be easier to blend. Canvas, again, it depends on the quality of the canvas, but the first pass of paint on a canvas can be very absorbent, so you need to build up layers. I'm painting this cast in one go, so there's a lot of alla prima painting, so wet into wet rather than building up layers as much. Okay, I'm going to soften this side of the cast here because there's a nice soft shadow there, and mine's a bit sharp. So I can't soften that because the paint's slightly been absorbed by the panel, but I can use thick paint to blend two values or even three. So I have my background on one brush. My general cast value on another. And then we'll also use the shadow value. So we are creating a softer edge to this side versus the sharper contour on the left side of our painting. And so from there, you'd keep assessing the values and the shapes and trying to get as close as you can to nature. Site size is a corrective process. So right up until the very last mark, you are correcting things. And people find that quite difficult when they start, if they're not used to this idea that they're not comfortable making mistakes. But painting is often one big mistake that you're trying to correct. So don't worry if everything is wrong. The exercise is trying to get you to see what's wrong so that you can then address it and correct it. So the image is ultimately created by all the marks that you're trying to make to construct the cast. And so don't worry too much about needing a style or needing a way to paint for now. There's a good quote by Degas where he says that his style is the one thing that gets in the way of trying to paint what he sees. So it's through the process that you create the image, and nobody will create the same image as the next person. Even with the same setup, the same lighting, the same materials, there is a distinctive handwriting that is uniquely yours. And the nice thing about working on panel is that the surface is a very, it kind of holds the paint in a nice way. So you can really experiment with building up paint and pushing it around. And so I suggest just doing a number of studies on panel and a number of cast paintings to train your eye. I'm going to leave that cast painting where it is for today. But if I was to come back for another session, I could push some of the values, always trying to make the image closer to the setup, always trying to get it as close as I possibly can in terms of the value, in terms of the drawing. And the best way to learn how to paint really is just to keep practicing and keep making mistakes as well, because often I'd find that the paintings where I'd struggled the most and it had felt like a battle and I'd probably thrown the painting away, I'd actually learned the most, because then you learn what not to do and where your boundaries with the paint are, versus the paintings where they just seem to go suspiciously easily, and I wouldn't actually feel that I'd learned that much. So it's through that struggle that you'll become a better painter. Now that we've completed our cast painting, we're going to move on to a more complex setup, which will involve a whole new set of challenges and new colours to work with.